Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait a moment as people are coming in. Good morning. So glad everybody's here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everybody, to the Kentucky Harm Reduction and Recovery Community of Practice webinar series presented by Voices of Hope and the University of Kentucky Perinatal Research and Wellness Center. My name is Brooke West. I am a person in recovery and the training coordinator at Voices of Hope in Lexington, Kentucky. The goal of the community of practice is to bring together a group to engage in training, share best practices, and network around a common interest. Today, the topic of our community of practice is the Americans with Disabilities Act and what it means for people on medication for opioid use disorder, presented by Dr. Anna Maria South. Dr. South completed medical school at the Boonshoff School of Medicine and residency in internal medicine at the University of Kentucky. She's an assistant professor of medicine at the UK College of Medicine in the Department of Internal Medicine. She is board certified in internal medicine and addiction medicine. She works as a hospitalist and addiction medicine physician with an interest in vulnerable patient populations with substance use disorder. And before I hand it over to Dr. South, we've got a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today, please pay close attention to the chat because we have two opportunities for peer support specialists today. One opportunity for peer support specialist is to receive a continuing education credit certificate, continuing education certificate for this webinar. And so there will be a link for the certificate for continuing education for peer support specialists that is put in the chat at the end of the webinar. And you must stay until the end to receive the link to get your certificate. So that's one opportunity for peer support specialists today. The second opportunity for peer support specialists today is to receive up to $30 of Amazon e-gift cards by completing a sequence of surveys for a study that's being conducted by Dr. South. And so in order for that to work, you have to create a unique identifier and use the same unique ID for every survey for Dr. South. And it is suggested that you use the first letter of your last name and the last 4 digits of your phone number or something that you will remember and write that down so you'll remember it. And you also must enter your email accurately on every survey in order to receive the gift cards electronically. So for Dr. South's study, you need to complete 3 total surveys to receive the $30 in the gift cards. You must complete the first 2 surveys today during this webinar. One survey is pre-presentation, and I'm going to put that link in the chat very shortly. Dr. South has a QR code as well that she's going to talk about some more. And one is post-presentation. And so if you complete the pre and post surveys today, and enter your unique ID and your email correctly, you'll receive a $10 Amazon gift card in the email that you use. And then again in 3 months, you'll receive another survey. And if you complete that survey in 3 months using the same unique ID and enter your email accurately, then you'll receive a $20 Amazon gift card. So that's how it equals the $30 total if you complete the entire sequence. I know that is a lot to absorb, and Dr. South will be discussing it further. And we will stay on the webinar for a few minutes after the presentation to answer any questions about the survey to give you time for that. We are so excited to have this presentation today to learn more about ADA and implications for people on medications for opioid use disorder. So thank you so much, Dr. South, for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for this introduction. And it is my pleasure to introduce Sally Friedman, who will also co-present with me. And Sally is the Senior Vice President for Legal Advocacy at the Legal Action Center that fights discrimination against people who use drugs and people who have a substance use disorder. So you will have some medical expertise from me and some legal expertise from Sally. And we also have Rebecca joining, who also works for the Legal Action Center. So 2 legal experts and then a a medical expert. Brooke has already explained the survey well, so you need to complete 2 surveys today in order to be eligible for a $10 gift card. The first survey is here. If you have a smartphone, you can scan it for a QR code. Um, to get access to this survey. It'll come up with the consent first, so you have to press if you want to participate that you agree and put today's date and then submit it, and then it'll come up with the survey question. There's 8 demographic questions, getting your background, and then there's about 19 questions to answer. We'll take about 5 minutes to answer those questions. And then there will be a survey again at the end of the presentation. I'll talk about it then. And then the next survey will be sent to your email in 3 months. You will be eligible if we can match you by the unique identifier. That's why that's so important and why we suggested something that hopefully is easy to remember. Um, however, you will not receive the gift cards today because we have to verify everything and then submit it to the university to get the gift cards. So they will not be in your email today. They will come later on. I will give about 5 minutes for people to fill in the survey. And we will also be monitoring the chat. Um, and Brooke has also posted the link in the chat. So if you cannot access via a QR code, you can click on the link. I see there's some people that are just now joining. So up now is a QR code that you can scan to be eligible for the survey if you're a peer support specialist. There's a question in the chat. This QR code is only for if you want to participate in the study and the survey and be eligible for the gift card. There will be a different link for the continued education credit. All right, I'll give it about another minute. Oh, you do not need to sign it or date it. That was a question in the chat. That was in the beginning when you agreed to the consent. You don't need to sign and date it. That collects the date and collects your consent, so there's no signature required. So the most important things for us to track you are the unique identifier and then an email that you're willing to share for receiving a follow-up survey. So it's been about 5 minutes. Um, People are welcome to continue filling out this survey if you still need a few minutes as we start the presentation. But just make sure that you submit it um, immediately as you're done filling out the survey because we do have a timestamp on it, an electronic timestamp. All right, so to get started with our presentation, just so you know what to expect in the next hour and a half, we're going to talk briefly about medication for opioid use disorder, and then we're going to explain what the Americans with Disabilities Act means for people who are on medication for opioid use disorder, and give you some examples of discrimination that we have seen either in my medical practice or Sally in her legal practice, or that we've heard from people about happening or read about in the literature. We're going to talk about some current ADA settlements in Kentucky so you can see how the work is working here. And we're going to give you some resources where you can report some potential ADA violations should you choose to do so. Um, so first, I always want to start out by relating opioid use disorder as a chronic medical disease. And I do this with other physicians. I do this when I talk to my students or when I talk to people in the legal profession. So I really want people to understand that opioid use disorder is a chronic medical disease, just like other medical diseases, for example, diabetes. And just like any other chronic medical disease, we do have effective medical treatments to treat opioid use disorder. So, um, for every medical disease, we always recommend lifestyle modifications as well. So, for example, for diabetes, we might recommend things like carb counting, increasing exercise, monitoring blood sugars. Same for opioid use disorder. When we people engage in treatment for opioid use disorder, we recommend certain lifestyle modifications. But we also encourage community support. And here at Voices of Hope, you guys are very familiar with that part for opioid use disorder, knowing how important peer support specialties and a community is for treatment of opioid use disorder. And the same is true for diabetes as well. So, getting, for example, the whole family involved to make changes in what people eat, getting the community involved to engage in exercise, things like that. However, when we do treat diabetes or opioid use disorder, there's also significant differences that are mainly posed upon it by society. Because opioid use disorder and drug use are criminalized, and sadly, medication treatment for opioid use disorder is severely stigmatized, which leads to severe restrictions in access to medication for opioid use disorder and a lot of barriers that people encounter if they want to access medication for opioid use disorder. And that's why we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act here to try to eliminate some of these barriers to access. There are three different types of medications. I think most of you through the HEAL study might be familiar with this graphic, but the reason I wanted to put it up here is to explain that these three medications are not interchangeable. So it's not like you can just say, well, this patient can't have access to this medication, so we're just going to switch them to the other one. Just like you can't interchange these plugs if you need certain things. So methadone is a full mu receptor agonist. It plugs directly into the plug versus buprenorphine that is kind of like a converter plug that's being used. And then naltrexone is like the safety lock or the child lock that you put on the electric outlet. So it's a complete blocker of the mu receptor. And this is the table that I typically use to show to my colleagues to explain this in a medical way. So basically, I highlight that both methadone and buprenorphine treat opioid cravings and opioid withdrawal. And the most important thing is they reduce all-cause mortality. So any reason that people might be dying, they reduce. Um, and they also reduce opioid overdose mortality. So when I talk to patients, I think that's a lot of times the most important things for people is they don't want to die from this disease. And I have medication that I can offer them to help that. Naltrexone, on the other end, that's also known as the Vivitrol, the long-acting injection, does not treat withdrawal. There's minimal evidence that it does treat cravings. And we unfortunately do not have any evidence that it does reduce all-cause mortality. So then a lot of times people will ask me, well, what is the right medication for people to use? And the answer is whichever medication the patient is willing to take and wants to take and works for what their goals are in their life. Because only if the medication is taken, then it can prevent a patient from having an overdose. And I always highlight too that people that have an opioid use disorder have a mortality that's 6 times higher than the general population. So that means at any given point, somebody with an untreated opioid use disorder is 6 times more likely to die than somebody who does not have an opioid use disorder. If people are started on medication, and that's methadone and buprenorphine. Buprenorphine is also known under the name of Suboxone, Subutex, Sublocade. So if people engage in a medication like that, their mortality goes from 6 times greater than the general population to about 1.6 times. So these are medications that are significantly mortality reducing. And I always challenge my students. We prescribe so many medications. We prescribe antibiotics. We prescribe medication to treat diabetes, to treat high blood pressure. None of them have as high of a mortality reducing effect as these medications for opioid use disorder have. So I always challenge my students to look at that and think about all the medications we talk to our patients about and why it's so important to talk about medication for opioid use disorder. Despite how effective medication for opioid use disorder is, the access to medication is sadly terrible. And this shows a study from the New England Journal of Medicine from about 2 years ago that looked at how many people have opioid use disorder in the United States, and how many have been diagnosed with it, and then how many are in treatment and how many are on medication for opioid use disorder. And this article comes to the conclusion that sadly, less than 10% of people with opioid use disorder who could benefit from being on medication currently are on medication. And that's most likely due to limited access. So, in order to expand access and avoid discrimination for people who have opioid use disorder who are on medication, we'll talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I will hand it over to Sally for this. Sally, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, you can advance now. Hello, everybody. Nice to not really see you today, but be here with you. So I'm going to explain how federal disability rights laws can be a really important tool that you and other people can use to gain access to healthcare, jobs, personal liberty, the right to be with your family without discrimination. So, in a nutshell, there are a number of federal laws that prohibit discrimination against people based on their disability. And those laws include the Americans with Disabilities Act, which most people have heard of, which is known as the ADA, and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which applies to federally run programs or federally funded programs, the Affordable Care Act, which folks often know as Obamacare, which applies to federally funded healthcare, and the Fair Housing Act, which not surprisingly applies to housing. So together, these laws basically prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in almost every setting. And that's employment, healthcare, housing, pretty much anything the government does at any level, including its operation of the criminal legal system and the whole child welfare / family court / family regulation system, whatever you call it. So the laws are interpreted very similarly. So we're just going to use the shorthand term ADA when we're really referring to all of them. And what you might be wondering, why am I talking about disability rights laws today when we're talking about people with opioid use disorder? But as I'll explain in a minute, folks with opioid use disorder are generally protected by the ADA. But before I go into that, I just want to explain the purpose of these laws. So the purpose of these laws is that they recognize that people with disabilities are often shut out of all kinds of things in society because of assumptions about what they can and cannot do. So, people think the ADA, they often think of wheelchairs and hearing impairments and, people who need a ramp in order to gain access to a place where they live or a courthouse. Um, and that's all true, but the ADA is so much broader than that because people with disabilities, like I said, are shut out from all kinds of things in life because of kind of stereotypes and myths and assumptions about what they can and cannot do, and because of perception sometimes that they're just not as valued in our society. And so what we're going to talk about today is how that framework applies to people with opioid use disorder and other substance use disorders, and how these laws require looking at the individual and not just kind of brushing people aside based on stereotypes and assumptions. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, people with any type of substance use disorder are generally protected by these laws. Unfortunately, due to stigma and the criminalization of drugs, people who engage in the current illegal use of drugs have fewer protections, but they still have critical protections. So I'm going to explain that and in the next slide. So a lot of courts and the Department of Justice have said very clearly that people with substance use disorder, including opioid use disorder, are generally protected individuals. So the law actually gives a definition. To be someone with a disability, you have to have an impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The federal regulations actually say that drug or alcohol addiction is an impairment. So the question is whether it substantially limits one or more major life activities. And many courts have said that it can, depending on the person, it can limit major life activities of thinking, caring for oneself, neurological and brain functioning. So there's no such thing as an automatic disability. Whatever your disability is, you have to still show that it significantly limits one or more major life activities, but substance use disorder generally does. And this includes people who are taking medication for opioid use disorder, or MOUD, as I'll call it. There's a lot of discrimination, as we'll talk about, against people who take MOUD, and they are protected. That MOUD is not an illegal use of drugs, it's a prescribed medication. These laws also protect people who are participating in substance use treatment programs. Generally, that's true as long as they are not currently engaging in the illegal use of drugs. Next. Oh, so what this means for people with opioid use disorder. Well, actually, before I get into this, I just want to also clarify. Actually, Dr. South, can you go back to the next slide, prior slide? I just want to say that the law has a very strange and really unfair distinction between people who have alcohol use disorder versus other forms of substance use disorder. So if you're currently using alcohol, you still have the full protections of the ADA. But if you're currently using drugs illegally, your rights are more limited. And there's really no clinical explanation for this. This is really just politics and stigma, and it's what was written into the law when it was enacted over 30 years ago. So we'll talk about but what we want to try and do is help you maximize the limited protections for people currently using drugs, as well as for those people who are in recovery. Okay, next slide. So what protections do these laws have, assuming that you are an individual with disability? Basically, what they say is you cannot deny somebody a job, housing, healthcare, or any kind of government service or benefit because the person is in treatment or recovery from opioid use disorder. So it means that you can't exclude people from a service. You can't provide them with unequal access to that service or activity. You can't impose some kind of eligibility requirement that makes it harder for them to access whatever it is. You also cannot prohibit or restrict MOUD without a legitimate reason, which there almost never is. And again, this is because decisions about people with disabilities have to be made individually based on legitimate, objective reasons and not stereotypes or assumptions, either about them or about the medication they use. Now, there's so much stigma about methadone and buprenorphine, where people often view it because they are both opioids. There's so much misunderstanding about these medications, and they're often viewed as substituting one addiction for another, not true recovery. People who receive medication for opioid use disorder are often kind of unfairly suspected of diverting their medication, so they're not trusted. They're often unfairly assumed to be using the medication to get high. So they're, because of all these false understandings about these medications, in all kinds of places in society, people are told they can't be on them, or they've got to switch from one to the other, or their dose is too high and they have to lower it, or they've been on it for too long. And this is the kind of discrimination we see almost on a daily basis. And that is discrimination because it is taking an action based on kind of stereotypes and myths about the medication used to treat this medical condition. It's not based on legitimate, objective medical evidence. As I mentioned, people who are currently using drugs don't have the same protections, but there's a critical protection in the ADA that folks cannot be denied health services because of their current illegal use of drugs. And so we're going to talk about that because a lot of people don't know about that. People who do know about the ADA will often say, oh, but it doesn't protect you if you're currently using drugs. And that's not entirely true, as you will see. Next slide. Okay, so I've just discussed some of the basic protections of the ADA, and I'm going to go through some examples of discrimination. And yep. So hopefully this will all become clearer as we go through the examples. So Julie is a 30-year-old woman who uses intravenous fentanyl, and she presents to the emergency room after her friends found her passed out. She gets treated for her overdose with naloxone. She wakes up and she's in withdrawal from opioids. The ER doctor does not offer buprenorphine to treat her withdrawal. And in fact, the ER never provides buprenorphine for opioid use disorder because it doesn't want to be seen by the community as a Suboxone clinic. Do you think this is a potential ADA violation? So you can write your answer in the chat, and this is not a graded test. So just write whatever you think. And we're using the word potential ADA violation. So you don't have to feel like you're absolutely committing. Although it seems that some of you are very ready to absolutely commit by writing absolutely exclamation mark. Okay, well, if there are any doubters in the audience, they are not speaking up because everybody is saying they think it violates the ADA. So very good. Maybe you don't really need this webinar because you already know the answers. So the answer is we believe it definitely could violate the ADA for emergency room doctors to not offer medication for opioid use disorder when it's clinically appropriate, along with naloxone and a warm handoff so the person can get continuing care in the community. And especially here in our example, we gave you the reason why they're not doing it. We said they don't want to be seen as a Suboxone clinic, which really just kind of screams out stigma. It's like they don't want kind of those people coming in. They don't want that reputation. So that's the kind of stigma that the ADA is trying to get at. And denying Julie the appropriate care because of she's a current drug user, that could violate the ADA. So Julie is protected by the ADA because even though she's currently using drugs illegally, what she was seeking in the ER is healthcare. So because of that, she does have the protections of the ADA. And so for the same reason, it would be illegal for a hospital to refuse to treat someone who comes to the ER with an injection-related infection. That's hard to actually say. If there's no clinical justification, and let me just unpack that. So basically, it's very common for people who inject drugs to end up in the ER with some kind of infection related to their injection drug use. And if the hospital had a practice of not treating people for such infections, because let's say they thought the patients could have brought this on themselves, or they're just going to go out and do it again, that it's just, and they don't want to encourage people to come into the hospital for these things, that would be a violation of the ADA. I do want to say that no court has actually ruled on the issue about emergency rooms and having to offer buprenorphine to individuals. But the Legal Action Center wrote a report about why we think this violates the ADA. And we've been encouraging people to file complaints about it. So this is a really important issue. And I should also say, we're not suggesting that people should be forced to take Suboxone. This is really a question about whether the ER should offer people this form of evidence-based care if they want it. We also would recommend that people be offered harm reduction services and a referral connection to harm reduction in the ER, in addition to MOUD. Next slide. Okay, so another common form of discrimination is denial of medical care to someone because they are on MOUD, specifically because they take methadone or buprenorphine for their opioid use disorder. And again, this is all because of the stigma that 99% of it, I'd say, is because of stigma. But clinicians are not allowed to force people to stop taking their MOUD in order to get some other kind of health care. And the way we've seen this play out, and actually, if people have seen this play out in their own lives with friends, colleagues, whomever, I'd love it if you could write that experience into the chat, and then we could talk about it at the Q&A. But what we have seen is doctors' offices refuse to take patients because they're on methadone or buprenorphine. In fact, there was a settlement that the Department of Justice entered with an orthopedic practice in New England that wouldn't take a patient because they were on buprenorphine. And mind you, this is like for some orthopedic issue, like nothing whatsoever to do with their substance use disorder or they're taking buprenorphine. And there's also been a case involving a primary care practice that wouldn't take a patient on buprenorphine. And the Department of Justice said both of those, they believe that those violated the ADA, and they entered into settlements with those medical practices. Also, you can't refuse to offer any kind of surgical services, such as a transplant, like an organ transplant, because someone's on MOUD. So there was another Department of Justice settlement involving the refusal of a Massachusetts hospital to do a lung transplant on a young man with cystic fibrosis. He was in his 20s. He had needed a lung transplant to survive because of this disease he had his whole life. And because he was taking buprenorphine for his opioid use disorder, the hospital refused to do the transplant, even though it was clinically appropriate. So there's nothing in the medical literature that said lung transplants are not appropriate for people with opioid use disorder or people on buprenorphine. There's absolutely no medical reason for it, but it was just bias about the person. And so he ended up having to go to a different city in order to get the transplant somewhere else and spend like 6 months in that city recovering at his huge expense, as you can imagine. And the Department of Justice said that violated the ADA, and they entered into a settlement agreement with the hospital, which had to pay a big fine as well. Next slide. So criminal legal system. And because of the way our society criminalizes drug use, well, largely because of that, there's a lot of people who are involved in the criminal legal system but do have opioid use disorder. And so the issue of can they be on medication for opioid use disorder? It comes up a lot. And I'm guessing a lot of you are shaking your heads. Yes, 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 I've seen this. So, so here's our example. JJ is a 45-year-old man who's on methadone for treatment of opioid use disorder. He's arrested for shoplifting and taken to the local county jail. He tells the jail staff that he's on methadone. They laugh and tell him he could get quote unquote comfort meds for his detox. The jail does not give methadone to people who are incarcerated. Predictably, JJ withdraws from methadone in the jail and is only given anti-nausea medications and something to help stop the diarrhea. Is this an ADA violation? Okay, I'm going to ask you to enter your thoughts into the chat. There's over 100 of you, so I'm giving folks a minute to think it through. Some good answers coming in here, people. Okay, I like the range of answers. Okay, well, some of you are honest and saying you're not sure. Most of you say yes, and some of you say no. And some of you are commenting about how it's not, some jails do it and some jails don't. One person says that's also cruel and unusual punishment. So let me explain. Next slide, please. Okay, so yes, it is discrimination for a jail to force somebody off methadone like that. And this is the reason why I think some of you aren't sure is probably because it's still really common. So what the story is it used to be so incredibly common that there were probably only a handful of jails in the entire United States that provided methadone or buprenorphine for opioid use disorder, except to pregnant people. Pregnant women have been allowed it because it's really dangerous for the fetus to not have access. But other than that, it was really almost never done in the United States until a few years ago. And what really changed it is people started suing, saying that this violates my rights under the ADA and the Constitution. So whoever wrote in that it's cruel and unusual punishment, you are spot on. So the courts have started issuing decisions that denying people methadone or buprenorphine when they're incarcerated can violate the ADA and the Constitution as cruel and unusual punishment. But, you know, change doesn't happen overnight. So even though courts have ruled this and the Department of Justice has entered into a number of settlement agreements with jails and prisons for not allowing MOUD, it's still not offered everywhere. And even where it is offered, it's not offered to everyone who needs it. And then sometimes people are disqualified unfairly. So it's a little complicated about how it's actually playing out in jails and prisons, which is probably why some of you are writing the comments you are writing. But basically, denying someone access to methadone or buprenorphine is denying them equal access to the jail's medical services. So getting back to our ADA framework, this is your moment to, you know, if you never went to law school, this is how you think as a lawyer, is that the ADA says the governments cannot discriminate in their provision of services or in anything they do. And jails and prisons are required to provide medical services to people. They are required to provide medication. So if you go in with a heart condition, the jail needs to give you access to your heart medication. So if you go into the jail or prison and you have an opioid use disorder and you need methadone or buprenorphine, or naltrexone, which is all these can be life-saving, for the jail to just have a policy that we don't give it, or we give it to this type of person, but not that type of person, or we'll give it to you while you're pregnant, but then we'll take you off as soon as you have a baby. That is all a violation of the ADA. And there are more and more courts saying that it is. But like I said, unfortunately, it doesn't mean that every jail and prison has kind of boom immediately changed the way they do things. So, but it's really important to know that these rights exist, and that when people are not given methadone or buprenorphine, it can be challenged. And so, and like I said, it's not just that they don't have to offer. It's not just that they have to offer one kind of medication or the other, because as Dr. South explained, it's not a one size fits all type of approach, right? So someone may be appropriate for Vivitrol, and that's what they want. Someone else may have tried Vivitrol and it did not work for them, or maybe they have some kind of medical reason why it's not appropriate for them, and they've been on buprenorphine. So it's really, you need the medication that works for you. And it's a little tricky with methadone because there's a lot of regulations around the just preventive methadone, and sometimes there's not even a methadone program in the geographic area for you to go into after you've been discharged. So it's a little bit complicated, but bottom line is a jail or prison is not allowed to just take you off your medication. And certainly not the way they did in our case study.
And I do want to just take a moment to acknowledge all the comments that people shared about how they either had this happen to them or somebody they know. And I am very sorry that this happened to you and that you have experienced a civil rights violation in that way, or violation of the ADA. Somebody wrote in the comments that if this also applies to jails or prisons who are privately run. And Sally, I don't know if you can maybe leave a comment on that.
Sure. Thanks. And thank you, Dr. South, for injecting your what some of the comments are. It's hard for me to kind of look everywhere at once. Yes, it also applies to privately run jails because it's just it's like a different section of the ADA applies to private healthcare facilities as opposed to government ones. So remember I said at the beginning that there's these 4 federal civil rights laws, and if you just take them together, they apply to almost everything. So it's private run facilities. Yes, they'd still be subject to at least one of these laws. And what we see often is also a jail may have contract out their medical services to a private medical provider, and there's some private companies that provide healthcare in lots of different jails and prisons. They've been sued too. So there have been lawsuits against the private medical providers. I'm not sure if there have been lawsuits yet against a privately run jail, but they should. The constitutional obligations wouldn't apply to a private facility. I don't think, but certainly the ADA would.
Yeah, and I think certainly too, it's kind of when people get incarcerated, hard to know who is owning the jail or who is, if it's
Right.
private or not. So I think just remembering that the ADA applies to carceral facilities across the
Right. And
board.
also, yeah, I mean, I'm not really a constitutional expert in all aspects at all, but if a private entity is kind of acting under color of state law, that's the phrase, which a private jail is, then it's possible that the Constitution would apply to them as well. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else I want to comment on, but okay, so I think we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, we're going to talk about other parts of the criminal legal system. So Jeremiah is a 30-year-old man who is on buprenorphine for treatment of opioid use disorder. He's on parole and he's going to a drug court because of his stimulant use disorder. His parole officer and the drug court judge say he is only able to participate in the drug court if he switches from buprenorphine to extended release naltrexone injections. In other words, Vivitrol. Is this an ADA violation? Okay, so Jeremiah is being told by the drug court he's got to switch from buprenorphine to Vivitrol. Is this an ADA violation? Okay, I think, and I did pretty much touch this earlier. So Okay. Almost everybody's saying yes, it's a violation, but one person points out that he's under the court's mercy, which is both things can be true at the same time, unfortunately. Something can violate the ADA or the Constitution and still happen, as I just explained, in the jail and prison context, and it's the same thing in the court context. It can happen even though it's a violation of the law. So let me explain. Next slide. So yeah, it is also discrimination for the same reason for any type of court, whether it's a drug court or criminal court, or parole department or probation, to discriminate against people because they take medication for opioid use disorder. And that discrimination could be forcing them to stop altogether, allowing one type of medication only, which this court did, or forcing someone to be on a medication, right? Again, we're not suggesting at all that people should be forced onto MOUD. People should be given the choice about to discuss with their own healthcare provider what's the appropriate form of treatment for them, and whether they want treatment or not, what kind of medication they want. So any interference with that clinical decision is basically a violation of the ADA, and we're not making this up. There have been a number of Department of Justice cases involving this exact kind of restriction on MOUD in all parts of the criminal legal system, in addition to jails and prisons. Their Department of Justice sued the entire state of Pennsylvania court system a couple of years ago for a lot of the courts were forcing people off buprenorphine and methadone, or allowing only Vivitrol, or allowing one medication or not another, or having kind of arbitrary time limitations, like you can only be on it for X number of months or years. And so Department of Justice brought this lawsuit saying that the whole court system was in violation of the ADA for allowing these kinds of practices. This was the first lawsuit like this anywhere in the country, and the case ultimately settled about a year ago. The court system fought it tooth and nail, arguing that the court system as a whole wasn't responsible for what the individual courts do. But they ended up settling it, like I said, and with the courts agreeing to allow MOUD and to train their employees about it. And so that doesn't mean that this doesn't still happen anywhere in the country. And there was also a couple of settlements in Massachusetts with the entire drug court system and the entire probation and parole system, saying basically that these entities can't interfere with clinical judgment about what form, if any, of medication is appropriate for opioid use disorder. So there's a lot of support, if this is happening in your area, to argue about why these kinds of practices violate the ADA. And someone just wrote in the chat that they've experienced encouraging clients not to take medication, which is a really important point to bring up. Sometimes the court won't prohibit the medication, but you might have someone who works in the court or a probation official saying, well, you don't really want to be on methadone, do you? So just, oh, you've been on that too long, don't you think? So there's all kinds of stigma and pressure in a lot of different places for people not to be on these medications. So again, it takes a while to shift culture, but it's really important to be able to use the legal rights in order to first establish that the right exists. Okay, next, please. So how does this play out with people who are pregnant? Crystal is a 22-year-old woman who is using intravenous opioids when she discovers she's pregnant. She wants to stop using opioids so she doesn't lose custody of her child, because this recently happened to one of her friends. But she doesn't think she can tolerate withdrawal and cravings unless she gets medication for opioid use disorder, and she's interested in starting methadone. But she's worried this will get her into trouble at the family court, and that she'll have to choose between being on methadone or having parental rights. So would it violate the ADA if, in fact, the family court said she couldn't be on methadone if she wanted custody of her child. I'm giving everyone a few more seconds to think, because I know I've seen we get some good answers later in our break, later as people are plugging their answers in. Okay, one person shared a really important thing to share, and I'm so sorry, that has 3 nephews in foster care today due to the mother continuing methadone treatment. Another person wrote, yes, it violates the ADA because she is doing what's in the best interest of her child. That is absolutely true. Okay, so let's advance the slides. She's going to have to deal with a court, that's for sure. Okay, so just like in the other context we're talking about, it violates the ADA to force people off their MOUD as a condition of anything, really. So here we're talking about as a condition of the right to parent your child or to have custody over your child. And I also think the people who weren't sure, or it's because you've seen this happen probably. And so it's so horrifying when it does happen, that people are actually taking the standard of care medication, getting better, staying well, which all helps them become good parents or stay as good parents. And yet the court is telling them to get off, which puts their own life at risk and certainly is not good for their children. So in fact, abrupt discontinuation of MOUD during pregnancy can lead to loss of pregnancy, as well as increasing the risk of maternal overdose. So in the last few years, there have been more official, entities, enforcement authorities, and courts saying that it is illegal discrimination to force people to stop their MOUD, whether it's the family court or the Child Protective Service Agency, because we've seen it happen from both places. And there have been 2 really important settlements that the DOJ, or the Office of Civil Rights, entered into with 2 different states, one in Pennsylvania and one in West Virginia, with the whole state agency, the Child Protective Services Agency. They're called something different in each state, but in both instances, the DOJ said that it violated the ADA to condition any kind of rights over a child on getting off medication for opioid use disorder. So in the West Virginia case, it involved, the complaint was filed by a couple who wanted to be the guardians of their nephew, and were the family, the child welfare agency said they couldn't be because they were on methadone. And in Pennsylvania, it was, I think, a foster care. Someone wanted to be a foster parent, but they were on buprenorphine. And so, those are great settlements for you to use in your advocacy if this is happening in Kentucky. But we still see this happening. I have to say, at the Legal Action Center, we still get complaints about it. So I know it still goes on. And I find it one of the most painful types of client complaints that we get. I can't imagine anything more painful than having your child taken from you because you're on the medication, because you're doing what science and the medicine tells, we all know is the right thing to do. Let's move on.
Yeah, and just to add to this, I think that was really well said, Sally, that it must be really awful for this to happen if you're doing what the right thing is. I just want to point out, Phoebe put in the comments, you cannot force an individual to take medication, nor can you force a person to come off medication. This is their individual choice. So I think that we really want to highlight that it's a case of someone being forced to not take the medication. And Phoebe did an excellent job putting this in the comments. And then Jensen also said that they violate people's rights, but they have been getting away with it for years because nobody is fighting it. And that's exactly the reason why we're having this webinar, so that we can get more information on this and show you how to report these. Um, all right, and I will move
Well,
on to
before
the.
you go on, it just makes me want to say something else, because I've been
Yes.
doing this work on this issue for, I don't know, since the early teens, is that we call them, the 20 teens. I still don't know how to refer to decades in this century. But so when we started doing this work, the Department of Justice and Office of Civil Rights hadn't yet done anything on this issue, and courts hadn't done anything on this issue. And we were getting every variation of some horrible thing happening in the family courts, where a judge would say to a woman, why is your dose of methadone so high? You're a small woman, so like this, the kind of assumption is that you must
Yeah.
be abusing this, so because your dose is too high. Or why are you still on this medication? It's been so long. Or I told you to taper off your buprenorphine, but you haven't fully tapered yet. That must mean you aren't really trying hard enough. So instead of acknowledging that it's hard to taper off because the medication is working at the dose that you were on, it was the right dose, and you were able to care for your child and to hold down a job when you're on the right dose of buprenorphine. But when the judge ordered you to taper off over time, you started struggling. And then the judge is faulting you for that, when the judge is the one who created that problem in the first place. So that's the kind of thing that we would see a lot of. And because of people filing complaints that kind of prompted government enforcement agencies to do something about it, and courts to say something about it, and it also prompted courts to train judges about this, that we've seen it's the pendulum has swung a lot in the opposite direction. So it still goes on, but not as much as it used to. And advocates are more successful at stopping it when it does happen.
That's a great perspective to have that decades long experience. And even though there's still a lot happening, that a lot has changed too.
So next slide, please. So now we're going to shift to the workplace. Matt is a 42-year-old man with opioid use disorder who's on methadone and no longer using illicit opioids. He applies for a job at a construction site and is worried that he won't be selected for the job because he's on methadone. Would the employer violate the ADA by refusing to employ Matt? I've noticed that people who think yes always answer first. And the people who aren't sure, or maybe think no, answer a little bit later. That's why I like to wait. Okay, Caitlin, I like your answer, because you're really hitting at something. Alicia said that this happened to her years ago. Okay, so I think we got mostly yeses, but people also say, yeah, but this happens. And what about liability? Those are all really good answers. So next slide. So here, I mean, yes, it would violate the ADA for an employer to just have an automatic policy that you can't work in construction because you take MOUD. So, and there have been a number of cases on this in courts and brought by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal agency that is charged with enforcing employment discrimination laws, that basically employers can't deny you a job just because you take MOUD. And so those that have like a blanket ban would be illegal. And this is because employers have to do an individualized assessment to see if you are able to perform the required tasks. There is an exception for commercial driver's licenses. Unfortunately, the U.S. Department of Transportation regulations for getting a commercial driver's license say you cannot be on methadone. This has been in some little guidance that was written a really long time ago. Oddly, this was before buprenorphine was even FDA approved for opioid use disorder. So it only talks about methadone and not buprenorphine, which just shows how kind of wacky these provisions can be. So so that's still a big problem. So if you need a CDL, a commercial driver's license for a job, then you probably won't be able to get it if you're on methadone. You maybe could get it if you're on buprenorphine. But other than that, even in jobs that are safety sensitive, which is how they're known, like jobs that require driving or operating machinery, we gave you an example of construction because it's could be a safety sensitive position. You can't just automatically bar people from working because they're on methadone or buprenorphine. You still have to do an individual assessment to see if they're able to perform their job. So, for example, this employer would have needed to, they could have asked Matt, for or to sign a release so they could speak to his treatment provider to make sure that he's, stable in treatment and is not impaired at all from his methadone. They could have done that, but they didn't do that in our case study. And so what we tend to see the most discrimination, employment discrimination against people on MOUD tends to be most commonly in a job that's perceived as safety sensitive. But it's really important to know that unless it involves a commercial driver's license to drive between states, then there really can't be an automatic bar, and it can be fought. Next slide. Okay, we're going to now talk about Christine, who's 53, and she is on buprenorphine for opioid use disorder, no longer using illicit opioids, recently started to smoke methamphetamines for energy. She's applying for a job as a cook, and she's worried she won't be hired if her urine drug screen is positive for buprenorphine and methamphetamine. Would the employer violate the ADA by not hiring Christine because of a positive drug screen for buprenorphine and methamphetamine? Okay, so the question here is, would the employer violate the ADA? So a yes means yes, they'd violate the ADA. No means no, they wouldn't. Okay, I think a lot of you have the answer. So this is really good. A lot of you are clearly seeing the difference between this case study and the last one. So next slide, actually maybe 2 slides up. And you're correct. Those who wrote no because of the methamphetamine is correct. So remember at the beginning that I said that people who are currently using drugs illegally don't have the same protections. So here, because Christine is using methamphetamines illegally, she is not protected under the ADA for denial of a job based on that. So they can't deny her the job because she's on buprenorphine, which is a legal medication, but they can deny her the job because of the positive test for methamphetamines. So again, because this can be really confusing, if it was healthcare she was seeking, she couldn't be denied it because of a positive screen for methamphetamines. But because it was employment she was seeking, she could be denied because of that. Okay, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I just saw a question I'm going to quickly answer. What if the drug they're abusing is a legal drug used illegally? That's a good question. So it's about illegal use. So if someone is, let's say somebody else has ADHD meds that they bought from a friend or they bought on the street, that is technically illegal use of that drug. And so it would be considered current illegal use of a drug. Okay, let's shift to the healthcare context. So Christine's a 53-year-old woman who's taking buprenorphine for opioid use disorder and no longer using opioids illegally. This is very familiar. She recently started to smoke methamphetamines for energy. She's interested in establishing care with a primary care physician to manage her newly diagnosed diabetes. She's worried that a doctor will refuse to see her because she's on buprenorphine and using methamphetamines. Would it violate the ADA for the doctor to refuse to take Christine as a patient because she takes MOUD and uses methamphetamines? Okay, I think I even gave you the answer in my last slide because I was jabbering away about this. So yes, and also I'm realizing I'm kind of running out of time. So I'm going to give you the answer. If we could just advance 2 slides and say yes. And someone was listening. They said, yes, Stacy said, yes, you did give us the answer. So it is discrimination to withhold healthcare from someone because they use illicit substances. Okay, so doctor cannot do what employer could do. It's also discrimination to withhold healthcare because someone takes MOUD. And I gave you the examples of some settlements the Department of Justice had on this topic, right? So this is different from employment. So really important for you to remember this because there's still a lot of healthcare discrimination out there, and it's illegal to discriminate against people because they use drugs illegally. Next slide. Okay, so I got carried away in talking about examples of discrimination because I get very passionate about this topic. So I'm going to now go through some of the settlements in Kentucky on these exact issues. Okay, so there's been some fantastic work by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Kentucky on these issues. And one extremely important one is a settlement between the United States of America and King's Daughters, which is a large healthcare system in Kentucky. Oops. And basically, somehow we lost that slide, Dr. South. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, I was trying to scroll in the chat.
It's okay. No problem. Basically, what happened at King's Daughters had an outpatient psychiatric program where they provided medication management and other services, but they had a policy that they would deny outpatient psychiatric services to anybody with a history of alcohol or drug use, current substance or alcohol use disorder, and if someone had been on MOUD in the last 6 months, they couldn't receive medication management. Oh, and even more than that, they had a policy to deny all services to people that had drug-related criminal convictions. So they would check the CASPR, which is the prescription drug monitoring system, and if they saw a drug-related conviction, you could not be a patient there. So the DOJ investigated and found that this all violated the ADA and entered into a settlement agreement that said they had to stop. So that is the first case like this in the entire country, and I just really want to highlight it. There are also 2 different settlements with county jails, one the Fayette County Detention Center and one the Big Sandy Regional Jail, where they found that the jails were violating the ADA by forcing people to stop MOUD. And so I understand that jails continue to do this in Kentucky, but what we want to do is leverage all these settlements to get the other ones to stop doing it. Next slide. Okay, so now you know what discrimination looks like and how enforcement agencies around the country and in Kentucky and courts have come down and said this stuff is discrimination and has to stop. So the question is, what can you and other people do about it? Next. One is you can advocate. I should say the first thing you can do is get educated, and you're doing that now. So bravo, that's the first step to advocacy, is to knowing what it is that is against the law. And there are nonprofits that can help you. So Legal Action Center, we're here. And actually my coworker, Rebecca Job, is on quietly. She may chime in at some point. But Rebecca and I try to help people from around the country. We can't represent people in other states generally, but we have on our website, we have an online intake form, and we will send you resources or try and make a referral. But more importantly, in Kentucky, we have a partnership with the Kentucky Equal Justice Center. And in the next slide, I'm going to give you a QR code so you can get their contact information. We're working on a project with them where to try and address discrimination against people who use drugs in healthcare settings. And so there's a fantastic lawyer there, who and a field worker who are fielding complaints or going out into the community and talking to people. Our hope after this program is that you will be in a better position to identify discrimination and refer cases to them, because all the cases I've talked about today where there's been a DOJ, Department of Justice settlement or court case, they all started with someone filing a complaint, right? Someone said, this sounds like it violates your rights or it violates my rights, and I want to do something about it. That's how every single one of them started. The ACLU also has brought in some great cases on these areas, and there's a Kentucky chapter that might be able to do something. Folks can also file complaints with the Department of Justice. And I've already mentioned, so the Department of Justice has offices around the country. Each one is headed by a U.S. attorney. Like I mentioned, there's someone who's fantastic in the U.S. Attorney's office in Kentucky, she's the one who spearheaded all the settlements I've talked about so far today. I know we live in a very uncertain times with what is the Department of Justice all about today. So some of you may be saying, really? The Department of Justice is going to do something about this. I cannot speak for the Department of Justice, but I can say I do speak with people in the Department of Justice, and I'm assured that people should keep these complaints going, like file the complaints, and let us know and Kentucky Equal Justice Center know when you do. We know people at DOJ, and so we give them a heads up if someone's filing a complaint. So if you see anything like what we've been talking about today, first contact Kentucky Equal Justice Center. They will contact us because we're working in partnership. We will figure out what strategy makes sense. We will support you. And if the person happens to have money to hire a private attorney who has expertise in disability rights or civil rights, they can go that route too. We also at the Legal Action Center will provide backup support to private attorneys working on this issue. Rebecca and I will help lawyers anywhere who are working on this issue. Next slide.
Okay, and we will do the questions in a second. I just want to fast forward one slide to show you the QR code that Sally was talking about for the Kentucky Equal Justice Center. So we have the website here, and if you scan the QR code with your phone, you can get directly to their intake form to report a potential violation. And you can also report violations that have happened in the past. And then Brooke, I don't know if we can maybe put the link in the chat as well. So I will move on. We will share a copy of the slides afterwards. I will just remove the QR code for the pre and post training surveys from those. But this QR code for the Kentucky Equal Justice Center will be in the slides that we share. Here is the post-training survey. So I'm going to leave that up here. Brooke, maybe if you can put the link for people who need the link, and everyone else can scan the QR code. As a reminder, in order to link your pre and post survey, we will need the unique identifier that matches, which is why we asked to use something that you can remember and write it down. And then it's really critical that you also remember this unique identifier for the survey that we will send you to the email address in 3 months. If we're able to match the unique identifier, and all we look at is if the unique identifier matches and you filled out a pre and a post survey. If that matches, we will send you an Amazon gift card when we have those available. And then we will also send, so this first Amazon gift card will be $10, and then the repeat in 3 months will be an additional $20 if we can match it and you filled out all 3 surveys. We will leave the QR code up for the post-training survey, and we will also do the Q&A. Sally, if it's okay with you, I will start by asking the first question. It says, this isn't related to MOUD, but it is related to substance use. What should someone do if their healthcare provider won't treat their hepatitis C because they are actively using illicit substances?
So really glad you asked that question. I guess, and it's really good that Dr. South is on too, because the first question is there any clinical reason for it? So whenever we get a question about denial of healthcare because someone's currently using substances, the first thing we need to find out is this clinically justifiable or not? So I would call Dr. South and I would say, Dr. South, is that clinically justifiable?
And I would say probably not, right? Because we would want someone's hepatitis C to be treated to minimize the health risks for themselves and to also minimize the risk for the general population and spreading of disease. So I cannot, off the top of my head, think of a clinical reason why hepatitis C treatment would not be indicated.
So in that case, it would be a violation of the ADA because it is a classic example of making a medical care decision based on assumptions and stereotypes probably about the person's behavior, thinking that they're not going to comply with a treatment regimen, or they're going to, maybe if they get better, they're going to get reinfected. So it's these kind of assumptions about the person's behavior that are driving the decision. And that is what makes it medical discrimination. And in fact, I'm glad you asked that question because the state of Alabama had a Medicaid policy where the Medicaid wouldn't cover hepatitis treatment for people who had used drugs or alcohol within like the last 6 months. These are known as sobriety requirements. And the Department of Justice said that violates the ADA and entered into a settlement agreement where they had to change their policy. Kentucky, my understanding, currently has a policy where they won't, if someone has been treated for hepatitis and then they reacquire an infection, they can't be retreated, it's called, if they don't have some kind of sobriety record. I forget precisely what the rule is. But so that's something that I know folks in Kentucky are looking into correcting. So if you do see any of these kind of hepatitis discrimination issues, absolutely, please contact Kentucky Equal Justice Center for that.
Absolutely. And then just to add to it, because I know sometimes, if you report somebody for an ADA violation, it can be uncomfortable to go back there to seek further medical care. And then also sometimes these medical needs cannot wait until the process has played out for an ADA violation. So it's always also an option to look for another doctor and report as well at the same time. And I'm sorry that people who are having the burden of the disease then have to do the burden of finding additional medical care. That is not fair, but I think sometimes we need to prioritize our own medical needs too. The next question in the chat, in the Q&A says, can a doctor who is prescribing you MOUD stop prescribing you the MOUD because you are on another medication? And so I think I'm going back to what Sally is asking earlier, is there a medical reason too? And in general, the answer would again be no, right? So for example, if I'm prescribing someone buprenorphine and they are being prescribed benzodiazepines by a different psychiatrist for whatever reason, I would have to counsel the patients on the risks of taking both medications together, but I would not stop prescribing their buprenorphine because of them being also prescribed benzodiazepines. And this is just an example that I'm making up. It was not in the question. So if I'm not getting at the question, please let me know. And then so I think if a doctor has a policy that says I will not prescribe buprenorphine to somebody who is on this specific medication, it could be a potential ADA violation if it is a blanket policy. Sally, what do you think?
If it's a blanket policy, unless there's some clinical reason why like something can never be done from that there's always a medical contraindication or something like that. But if it's a blanket policy, that always raises an ADA issue. Unless there's a blanket clinical standard.
Yeah.
I just noticed there was a question in the chat earlier about sober living or recovery housing, and so I didn't want that one to go by. We know that a lot of recovery houses don't allow MOUD, or maybe allow Vivitrol but not methadone or buprenorphine, and we definitely believe that violates the Fair Housing Act. and the ADA. And there's also a Kentucky law that went into effect like a year and a half ago, about recovery housing. And there we have a flyer, like a Know Your Rights flyer about this. And actually, Dr. South, are we able to share some resources after this with folks who
Yes,
participated? Okay.
yes. I think
Uh,
if we send it to Brooke and Amanda, and then they can share it to you. I will send my slides.
because we are definitely interested, and we've talked about, taking on such a case. And that's like a whole long issue, but yes, we believe it violates these laws to prohibit MOUD in a recovery housing setting.
And I am going through the chat and I'm going to read the questions as I come across them. So Marshall is asking, I feel as if it is going to take us reporting potential ADA violations to help progress change in our correctional facilities. I have asked about a possible timeline to get to ADA compliance and no one has an answer to when it will happen. Is reporting our best advocacy option for the substance use disorder population?
With the question at the end, it was what?
If reporting is the best advocacy
Oh,
option.
and I think by reporting, you mean like filing complaints,
I
reporting
think so.
violations. I think it's important. There's no silver bullet to address this, but I think, and I can't say what the capacity of the Department of Justice is at the moment to bring more and more settlements, but yes, also Kentucky Equal Justice Center is interested in working with us on a lawsuit in Kentucky about this. So I would say yes, right now, please bring those to the attention of the Kentucky Equal Justice Center, and to the Department of Justice. There's, needs to be work on all levels. Policy advocacy is obviously is very important as well. But the lawsuits can help drive the change.
The next question is, we had a question about health insurance. If you received MOUD at a clinic and you lost your health insurance, can they refuse to provide medication?
Yeah, I saw a number of people talked about health insurance, and unfortunately, that is another huge barrier, right? And a lot of people are on MOUD and then they have to stop because there's a lot of discrimination within insurance as well, which is kind of beyond what we're talking about today. So I can't answer that question, give you a simple answer. No, I mean, I think that healthcare providers are generally allowed to charge for services. And so unfortunately in our society, if you can't pay, sometimes you can't get care, at least from that place. And there are other options. We all know that there's a lot of cuts coming down from the federal government right now. And so it's a very challenging time with threatened cuts to Medicaid. And just this week, there was an announcement about cuts to grants that helped states fund substance use disorder care. So I'm going to just say that if it involves payment, it's like a different set of issues.
Yeah, I agree. And we do have some clinics that take sliding scale for people who do not have insurance. So that might also be an option to look into. The next question in the chat is, I was recently approved for a medical cannabis card from a healthcare provider, but I was denied by the state because of my criminal history. Isn't that a form of discrimination?
It could be. I feel like I'm not ready to, kind of give you a clear answer on that one without knowing more, because the medical cannabis is governed. It's a state, every state has a different law about how they do that. So I would say that, you could bring that to the attention of Kentucky Equal Justice Center as well. We'd have to look at it a little more carefully.
Wonderful. The next question is, does it violate the ADA to have people with no training on MOUD making decisions on whether a person leaving incarceration should be allowed to have MOUD? So with no training, I'm assuming this person means like somebody that's not a medical provider.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, what is it about starting the person on MOUD before they leave? And so I think I would say it could, but I'd need to understand more exactly what the situation is. And whether it's a question of, they have a MOUD program and they limit who has access to it, because unfortunately that's the case in a lot of places. So I'd have to know a little bit more. But again, bring that to the attention of Kentucky Equal Justice Center as well. basically, there's nothing that you're going to ask me right now that I'm going to not say. Bring that to the attention of the Kentucky Equal Justice Center. We're really working with them hard on finding a case to take. And so don't hesitate at all to contact them. And if you, for some reason, can't get in touch with them, Dr. South can get you in touch with them, and so can we.
Yeah, and I'll just go back one slide and pull up the intake form again in case somebody who just asked a question now would like to report something. And I think that's just in general, right? For us, like I didn't go to law school, so it's really hard for me sometimes to suss out like all the different nuances. But I think that's where the Kentucky Equal Justice Center really comes in, that they can do that for us. So they rely on us for making potential reports, and then they can investigate further and decide if it is or not. So I would encourage everybody to um, raise all those questions there.
Did you want to, should we stop now for the survey? I'm noticing it's 3 minutes before the
Yeah.
end.
I will go back to the survey for those of you who have not filled out the survey, so you can scan it and start it. And I want to thank everybody for participating in the webinar and thank Voices of Hope for hosting us.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria and Sally, for your presentation today. That was wonderful. And the links are in the chat for the continuing education certificate, which is separate from the survey happening here, the QR code that's on the screen currently. So look carefully in the chat for those. But what a great discussion today. Education and this, I mean, call to action to file claims and to know our resources. And yes, Amanda and I will be sending out, we can send out the slides and other resources that we that you want us to share with the group today. And we'll stay on just for a couple minutes as people are finishing the survey. And it looks like Danita has her hand raised. Danita, if you want to put your question in the chat. And thanks everybody for being here today. The participation was wonderful. And thanks so much for like all the vulnerability that was shared in the chat and for just, I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking stories really, but thank you so much to everyone who participated and shared today.
I just want to say I am incredibly grateful by the amount of participation. And also, you know, we've been working in Kentucky for a couple of years and honestly have had a hard time finding cases. So I feel like you guys are going to do it. You know, I think everything's going to change after today. So I really look forward to seeing what you bring us and to working with some of you on, you know, making a difference in this area. And also Legal Action Center, we have a wealth of written kind of self-help materials on this and educational materials for those employers and healthcare providers and the folks that are discriminating. And we're always happy to give you the exact right thing that you can give to a doctor's office, a hospital, a judge, anything. So we look forward to continuing this collaboration.
I don't think any other questions came through in the chat. Lots of thank yous and lots of love for the presentation. It was really wonderful. Well, thank you everyone again for joining us here at the Community of Practice webinar. And we'll be back next month, the first Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. Thanks again, Sally. Thanks again, Dr. South.
Bye.